The grand hall was filled with the soft hum of elegant conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the distant melody of a string quartet. She stood there, her fingers tightening around the golden-rimmed glass of champagne, watching as her husband smiled at another woman. The warmth in his eyes, the tenderness in his touch, it was everything she had once dreamed of, but it was never meant for her. For years, she had done everything to please him. She had learned to dress the way he liked, to speak softly, to never burden him with complaints. She had waited, hoping that one day he would look at her the way he looked at his mistress. But that day had never come. Tonight was their wedding anniversary, but the celebration was not for her. It was another excuse for him to parade his mistress before the world, a silent declaration that the woman by his side was not his wife but the one he truly cherished. The whispers around the hall were hushed yet sharp, cutting into her like tiny blades. She is still holding on. What a pitiful woman. She should have some dignity and leave. Her nails dug into her palm as she forced a smile, her throat tight with unshed tears. But she would not cry, not here, not in front of them. Instead, she turned away, moving toward the balcony for air. The cool night breeze brushed against her skin, but it did nothing to ease the suffocating weight in her chest. Behind her, the laughter continued. She did not need to turn around to know that her husband had wrapped his arm around the other woman's waist, whispering something that made her giggle. That giggle, it was soft, sweet, and filled with the kind of happiness she had never known in her marriage. Why had she ever believed that love could be earned? She had sacrificed so much, given up her dreams, her dignity, and even her self-worth, all in the name of love. But love was never meant to be one-sided. It was not something to be begged for. A sharp pain throbbed in her chest as the realization sank in. She had spent her life chasing a man who had never even turned to look at her. Just then, a deep voice interrupted her thoughts. "You are still here." Her breath caught as she turned to see her husband standing at the doorway of the balcony. He was watching her with an expression that was neither concern nor guilt, just mild annoyance, as if her presence was an inconvenience. "I thought you left already," he continued, taking a sip from his glass. "You looked bored." She opened her mouth, then closed it. What was she supposed to say? That it hurt? That she had waited all night, hoping for a single glance from him? That this was supposed to be their night, yet he had spent it with another woman? He did not wait for an answer. Instead, his gaze drifted back inside where his mistress stood, waiting. "Do not embarrass yourself any further," he said softly, almost as if he was doing her a favor. "It is better if you stop hoping. You will never be enough for me." Something inside her shattered. For a moment she felt nothing. Then the pain came crashing down, overwhelming, suffocating. She had always known the truth, but to hear him say it, to have him confirm that she was nothing to him, it made breathing impossible. The world blurred. The sound of the party, the glow of the chandeliers, the stars above, it all faded into nothing. Then darkness. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the grand hall. She was lying on a familiar bed, her body aching, her heart pounding wildly against her ribs. She knew this room. She had lived in it before. Her hands trembled as she reached for the bedside lamp, her breath catching when the soft glow illuminated the space around her. This was her bedroom from years ago. The old curtains, the wooden dresser, the small mirror by the vanity. Everything was exactly as it had been before. Slowly, she turned to look at her hands. They were smooth, unscarred by time. Her reflection in the mirror was younger, untouched by the bitterness of heartbreak. Her heart raced as realization dawned upon her. She was not dead. She had gone back in time. She had been given another chance. The morning light filtered softly through the sheer curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. She lay still, staring at the ceiling, her heart hammering in her chest. The weight of what had happened, of where she was, pressed heavily upon her. She had gone back in time. Her fingers clenched the sheets as memories flooded her mind. The years of pain, the countless nights spent waiting for a man who never came home, the whispered conversations behind her back, the cruel indifference in his eyes. She had lived through it all, endured it all, believing that if she only loved him enough, if she proved herself worthy, he would finally see her. But he never did. She had given him her heart, her devotion, her entire being, and in return, he had crushed her without hesitation. The humiliation of that night, his words slicing through her like a blade, echoed in her mind. "You will never be enough for me." A slow, bitter smile formed on her lips. It had taken her death to finally understand the truth. He was never meant to be hers. And now, fate had given her a second chance, not to win his love, but to set herself free. The door creaked open, and a maid peeked inside, startled to see her awake so early. "Madam, shall I prepare your bath?" She nodded absent-mindedly, still lost in thought. As she rose from the bed, the reflection in the mirror caught her attention once more. She looked so much younger, her features untouched by exhaustion and sorrow. This was before everything fell apart, before she had wasted herself on a man who never wanted her. But not this time. She stepped into the warm bath, the water enveloping her in a soothing embrace. As the maid washed her hair, she kept her eyes closed, making a silent vow. She would not beg for his attention. She would not lower herself for his affection. If he wanted his mistress, he could have her. She would no longer stand in the way. Dressing in a soft ivory gown, she descended the grand staircase, the familiar scent of roses wafting through the air. The house was just as she remembered, yet it felt different now. Perhaps because she was different. As she entered the dining hall, she saw him sitting at the head of the table, reading the morning paper. He barely glanced at her as she took her seat, as he always did. But this time, something inside her did not ache at his coldness. She reached for the teapot, pouring herself a cup with steady hands. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, but she had no desire to break it. She sipped her tea, savoring its warmth, while he continued to ignore her presence. Minutes passed before he finally set his paper down. "You are quiet today." His voice held no real curiosity, only mild observation. She looked at him, truly looked at him. The man she had once worshipped. The man who had held her heart in his hands and crushed it without a second thought. "Is there something you wish to discuss?" she asked, her tone polite yet distant. He frowned slightly, as if something about her response was unexpected. In the past, she would have used this moment to grasp at his attention, to ask if something was wrong, to try and please him in any way she could. But not anymore. "No," he replied after a pause, his gaze lingering on her for a second longer before he returned to his meal. A strange sense of liberation washed over her. She had spent so long hanging on to his every word, searching for signs of affection that were never there. But now she felt nothing. As the days passed, her resolve only grew stronger. She no longer waited for him at dinner, no longer sought out his company. She occupied her time with things she had once abandoned, reading, painting, even walks in the garden. For the first time she lived for herself. And he noticed. It was subtle at first, the way his eyes would flicker toward her when she laughed with the maids, or the way his brow creased when she failed to react to his presence. She could feel his confusion, the way he struggled to make sense of the shift in her demeanor. One evening, as she sat in the parlor reading a book, he entered without a word. She did not look up, did not acknowledge him as she once would have. "You seem different lately," he remarked, his voice calm yet searching. She turned a page, her expression unreadable. "Do I?" His jaw tensed slightly. "You do not seem as involved as before." A soft chuckle escaped her lips. "I suppose I have simply realized a few things." He did not reply immediately, and when she finally met his gaze, there was something unfamiliar in his expression, something almost uncertain. "You do not ask where I go anymore," he finally said. She smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Because I no longer care." The words seemed to unsettle him, but she did not stay to see his reaction. Rising from her seat, she walked past him without another word, leaving him standing there in silence. The next day, she made her decision known. As they sat in the drawing room, A rare moment where they occupied the same space. She spoke without hesitation. "I will not stand in your way anymore." He looked up from his papers, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" She met his gaze, unwavering. "I know about her. I always have. You do not need to hide it anymore. She is the one you love, then be with her. I will not stop you." For the first time in years, true silence stretched between them. He stared at her, as if searching for a hint of emotion, a trace of the desperation she had always carried. But there was none. She was done fighting for him. She was done begging. She had set him free. And yet, as she turned to leave, she could feel his gaze burning into her back, as if, for the first time, he was the one who did not understand what was happening. At first he felt nothing but relief. For years, his wife had been a constant presence, always waiting, always watching, always hoping. She had followed him with silent devotion, her eyes filled with unspoken longing. He had grown used to it, to the way she hovered at the edges of his life, desperate for even the smallest bit of affection. And then, suddenly, she stopped. When she told him she would no longer stand in his way. He had expected something. Hesitation, regret, perhaps even a final plea for him to reconsider. But there had been nothing. She had spoken with a calm certainty that unsettled him in a way he could not explain. First he brushed it off. If anything, this should have made things easier. There would be no more strained conversations, no more expectations, no more lingering glances filled with silent questions he had never wanted to answer. She had finally accepted what he had known all along. She was not the one for him. And yet something was different. The house felt quieter, but not in the way he had expected. It was not the absence of noise but rather the absence of something else, something he could not quite place. He told himself he was imagining it. But then he began to notice. She no longer waited for him at dinner. That had been a small relief at first, but when he arrived home late one evening and saw the empty dining table, something in his chest tightened unexpectedly. She had always been there before, sitting with perfect posture, waiting patiently even when she knew he would not return until much later. Now, she ate whenever she pleased, and when he entered the dining hall, there was only silence. She no longer asked where he was going or when he would return. She no longer looked at him with those eyes that once held so much silent suffering. She no longer looked at him at all. He was not sure why it unsettled him. It was what he had wanted, was it not? He had never liked the weight of her expectations, the way she clung to the hope that one day he would love her the way she wanted to be loved. Now that weight was gone. He was free. But for some reason it did not feel like freedom. He told himself it was nothing. His mistress, on the other hand, was delighted. "You should have done this a long time ago," she whispered against his ear, her arms draped lazily around his shoulders. "She is pathetic, really. Always waiting for something that was never going to happen." He did not respond. "You are happier now, are you not?" she pressed, her fingers trailing down his chest. He looked at her, at the beautiful woman in his arms. She was everything his wife was not, bold, confident, unafraid to take what she wanted. She had always been his escape, the one who understood his desires without the burden of expectations. And yet, for some reason, her words did not settle right. He kissed her, hoping to push the thought away, but even as he lost himself in her touch, an unfamiliar irritation nagged at him. Over the following days, the feeling only grew. He began to notice things that had never caught his attention before. The way she laughed, light and unburdened, when speaking with the servants. The way she carried herself with quiet confidence, no longer shrinking under the weight of his presence. The way her eyes, once always searching for him, now seemed focused on something beyond his reach. And most of all, he noticed how radiant she looked. It was not beauty in the way he had seen before, delicate and subdued. It was something else entirely. A glow that came not from trying to be what he wanted, but from no longer caring what he thought at all. He should not care. But for the first time in his life, he realized that maybe he did. She had never known how much space love had taken in her life until she let it go. 4 years, every thought, every action, every decision had revolved around him. His needs, his moods, his desires. She had shaped herself into what she believed would make him stay, only to realize too late that no matter how much she changed, he had never been looking at her in the first place. Now she no longer tried. She woke up early in the mornings, not to prepare herself in the way he preferred, but because she enjoyed the quiet. She spent her afternoons reading in the sunlit garden, painting in the studio she had once abandoned, and walking through the bustling streets of the city. She had discovered that she loved the taste of strong tea, that she enjoyed the sound of rain against glass, and that solitude, when chosen, could be a beautiful thing. But the greatest discovery of all was herself. She had forgotten what it meant to have dreams of her own. She had pushed aside her ambitions, her passions, in the desperate pursuit of a love that was never meant for her. Not anymore. She returned to the things she once loved, studies she had abandoned, ideas she had once been too afraid to chase. The world was far bigger than the walls of her marriage, and she would not waste this second chance living in someone else's shadow. It was during this time that she met him. He was unlike her husband in every way. Where her husband had been cold, he was warm. Where her husband had only ever seen what she lacked, he looked at her as though she was something to be cherished. Their first meeting had been brief, a simple introduction at an event she had attended on a whim. He had been polite, charming, but what struck her most was the way he listened. When she spoke, he paid attention, not out of obligation but because he was genuinely interested. Their paths crossed again, and then again, as if fate itself was nudging her toward something new. She had once believed love was meant to be painful, something to fight for, something to earn. But this was different. There were no games, no silent pleas for affection. There was only ease, quiet companionship, the gentle warmth of someone who did not make her feel small. And for the first time in her life, she began to wonder, perhaps love was not meant to be begged for. Perhaps it was meant to be given freely, without condition, without suffering. But not everyone was ready to let her go. Her husband had been watching. At first, he had told himself it was curiosity. Then he convinced himself it was irritation. But the truth, the one he refused to acknowledge, was something far darker. He had thought her indifference would be fleeting, that she would eventually return to the woman he had always known, the one who waited, who longed, who endured. But she never did. Instead, she had flourished. And now there was someone else. He had seen them together, the way she smiled, the way she leaned in just slightly when she spoke. It was different from before. It was not the careful, measured politeness she had once used with him. It was real. Something twisted in his chest, something he refused to name. He told himself it was not jealousy. That would be absurd. She had never mattered to him, not in the way she wanted. And yet, he found himself searching for her, lingering in places where he knew she would be, watching as she moved through the world with a grace and confidence he had never noticed before. And he hated it. The realization struck him with an uncomfortable truth. He had never truly seen her. Not until now. And now it was too late. But he was not ready to accept that. The night he confronted her, the air was thick with tension. She had been walking back from an evening gathering when he appeared before her. His expression unreadable. "You have changed," he said, his voice quieter than usual. She met his gaze, unshaken. "Yes, I have." He studied her, searching for something familiar, something he could hold on to. "This is not who you are." Her lips curved into a small smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You never knew who I was." He took a step closer, his jaw tightening. "I have been patient, but do not think I have not noticed. The way you carry yourself, the people you surround yourself with. That man." She raised a hand, cutting him off. "What I do, and who I choose to be with, is no longer your concern." His fingers curled into fists. "You are still my wife. For now," she said simply, her voice calm. "But that will not last forever." His breath caught, and for the first time in his life, he felt something foreign, something unfamiliar creeping into his chest. Fear. Fear that he had let something slip through his fingers. Fear that she was truly leaving, not just in silence, but in spirit. But before he could speak, before he could grasp at something he did not even understand, she turned away. And for the first time he was the one left behind. He had never been a man who looked back. Regret was not something he allowed himself to feel. In his world, choices were made, consequences followed, and life moved forward. There was no room for second-guessing, no space for doubt. And yet, here he was, haunted by memories he had never cared to acknowledge before. He found himself replaying moments he had long dismissed, the way she used to look at him with quiet adoration, the way she always remembered the smallest details about his preferences, the way she had stood beside him when no one else did. He remembered the nights she had waited up for him, the way her eyes had lit up with hope whenever he so much as acknowledged her presence. He had never returned that affection, never given her a reason to keep hoping. But now that hope was gone. He saw it in the way she carried herself, in the way she no longer flinched under his gaze, no longer waited for his approval. She had let go of something he had not even realized she was holding on to, and it was driving him mad. His mistress noticed the change immediately. "You have been distracted," she said one evening, her fingers trailing lazily across his arm. He barely looked at her. She studied him, her eyes narrowing. "It is her, is it not?" His jaw tightened, but he did not respond. A slow, knowing smile spread across her lips. "She is only acting this way to get your attention. You should not let it bother you." He exhaled sharply. "You do not understand." Her grip on his arm tightened. "No, I understand perfectly," she hissed. "You did not want her when she was yours, and now that she is slipping away, suddenly you care? How predictable." He turned to her, his eyes dark. "Be careful what you say." But she only laughed, though there was no humor in it. "You are a fool if you think she is waiting for you. She is slipping away because she does not want you anymore." Her words cut deeper than he wanted to admit. He told himself that she was wrong, that his wife was only doing this to provoke him, to make him jealous. But the truth was far worse. She was happy. Without him. The realization sent an unfamiliar rage through him. He watched as she moved through life effortlessly, surrounded by people who admired her, by a man who clearly saw her worth in ways he never had. It was unbearable. The final blow came when he saw them together at an event. His wife standing beside that man, smiling, laughing in a way she never had with him. Something inside him snapped. The room fell into hushed whispers as he stepped forward, as he did the one thing he had sworn he would never do. He reached for her hand, forcing her to turn toward him. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice rough with emotion. The room fell silent. Eyes turned toward them, but he did not care. He had spent years dismissing her, pushing her aside, never once considering that one day she might stop waiting. Now, with everyone watching, he finally acknowledged what he had lost. But she did not falter. She looked at him with calm, unwavering eyes, the kind that no longer held any love for him. And then, without a word, she pulled her hand away. He turned, and she walked away. The night was cold, the air heavy with the weight of things left unsaid. He had spent weeks drowning in his mistakes, watching helplessly as the woman he had once dismissed flourished beyond his reach. It had become unbearable, the realization that he had spent years overlooking a treasure he had possessed all along. And now, standing before the woman who had whispered promises of love into his ear, he realized the depth of his blindness. "You used me," he said, his voice low, filled with something between anger and regret. His mistress smirked, tilting her head slightly. "Do not look so shocked. You always knew I was not like her." Something in his chest twisted. He had once found her confidence intoxicating, had been drawn to the way she took what she wanted without hesitation. But now, in the dim candlelight of the room they once shared, he saw her for what she truly was: ruthless, selfish, empty. How long? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. She laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. Does it matter? Did. It mattered more than he wanted to admit. He had spent years believing he was in control, believing he had chosen her out of love. But now, faced with the truth, he realized he had been nothing more than a pawn in her game. She had never loved him, only what he could offer, only the power and status he carried. And she had not even been faithful. He had spent so much time resenting the devotion of the woman who had truly loved him, only to be discarded by the one he had chosen instead. He had been a fool. For the first time he felt something unfamiliar, humiliation, regret so deep it burned. You should go, he said, his voice hollow. His mistress gave him one last smirk before turning away, disappearing into the night without a second glance. And now he was truly alone. But he could not let it end this way. Not without seeing her. Not without trying one last time. When he found her, she was standing in the garden, the soft glow of lanterns illuminating her face. She did not look surprised to see him. I was a fool, he said, his voice breaking. I see it now. She did not respond. I spent years dismissing you, pushing you aside. I thought you would always be there, waiting. I never thought you would leave. She tilted her head slightly, considering his words. And now that I have. He swallowed, stepping closer. I cannot bear it. For the first time, there was raw vulnerability in his eyes, a desperation he had never allowed himself to show before. He reached for her hand, but she did not move. I do not deserve your forgiveness, I know that. But if there is even the smallest part of you that still... She pulled her hand away before he could finish. You misunderstand, she said, her voice gentle but firm. I did not leave you to punish you. I left because I found something greater than your love. His heart clenched. And what is that? She smiled, a real beautiful smile. Myself. He felt his breath catch, the weight of her words settling deep into his chest. 4 years, he had been the center of her world, the force that shaped her every decision. But now, standing before him, she was radiant. Not because of him, not because of another man, but because she had finally chosen herself. And he knew, in that moment, that there was nothing he could say to bring her back. She had made her choice. And it was not him. She had spent too many years in the shadows of someone else's love, waiting for something that was never meant for her. Now she no longer waited. As she stood beneath the vast evening sky, a sense of peace settled over her. The weight that had once dragged her down, the desperate longing, the endless heartbreak, none of it held her anymore. She was free. He stood before her, his eyes filled with regret, with the sorrow of a man who had realized his mistake too late. But she felt nothing for him now. No anger, no resentment. Not even the satisfaction of seeing him broken before her. I love you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I did not realize it before, but I love you. There was a time when those words would have shattered her. A time when she would have given anything to hear them. But now, they were nothing more than echoes of a past that no longer belonged to her. She gave him a small, sad smile. Then it is a shame you only realized it when I stopped loving you. His breath hitched, and for the first time he truly understood. There was no undoing this. No second chance. She turned away, walking toward the life she had built for herself, the life that no longer revolved around him. There was no grand revenge, no dramatic punishment. The greatest revenge was simply this. She was happy without him, and he would have to live with that for the rest of his life.